March 4, 1943, Bismarck Sea, 5:12 a.m. The sky was black, the sea on fire. Captain Frank Dawson's B-25 thundered just above the waves, salt spray hammering its glass nose. Ahead, the Japanese convoy moved in perfect formation. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, a steel fortress crawling through dawn's mist. Every pilot knew this mission should have been impossible. But these bombers were no longer ordinary. In a jungle workshop far from any command post, one outlaw engineer, Pappy Gunn, had rewritten the laws of aerial warfare. He ripped out bomb bays, packed the nose with machine guns, and turned broken bombers into ship-killing beasts the Japanese Navy never saw coming. Before we start, hit that like button and tell us where you're watching from. Your support keeps these incredible WWII stories alive. March 4th, 1943, Bismarck Sea. 5:12 a.m. The ocean lay under a curtain of fog, cold and silent except for the faint hum of engines crawling over the waves. Captain Frank Dawson wiped the condensation from his cockpit glass. He could barely see 10 yards ahead, but he did not need to. He trusted the man flying on his wing, and he trusted the machine beneath his hands. A machine no longer recognized by any manual in the United States Army Air Forces. The crew called it the Baby Dragon. It was born not in a factory, but in a dirt workshop somewhere in New Guinea, where a man named Pappy Gunn had decided that rules were optional, and survival was not. The Bismarck Sea was death that morning. Below the clouds, the Japanese convoy steamed forward in perfect order. Gray hulls cutting through black water, anti-aircraft guns waiting for the first hint of daylight. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, thousands of soldiers on board carrying reinforcements for Leh. They believed no bomber could stop them. They had reason to believe it. Until Pappy Gunn came along, they had been right. Dawson's crew spoke little. The intercom crackled with the slow rhythm of breathing, the sound of gloved hands tightening around metal grips. In the tail, Sergeant Miller whispered to himself, repeating a prayer he had memorized long before the war began. The pilot's eyes flicked to the clock. 5 minutes until contact. He could already smell the sea, the raw, salty wind that clawed into the cabin through every loose seal. Then the radio buzzed. A single voice, steady, unshaken. "This is Pappy. Time to wake the bastards up." Dawson's jaw tightened. The modified B-25s dropped lower until their shadows skimmed across the waves. The fog thinned, revealing distant silhouettes of ships, lines of black steel glowing faintly from the fires of their own funnels. The Japanese had no idea death was approaching barely 50 feet above the water. What Pappy Gunn had done to these planes defied every order in the book. He had ripped out the bombardier's seat, replaced glass with armor, and filled the nose with 50 caliber guns. 4, then 6, then 8, until the front of the aircraft looked more like a destroyer turret than a bomber. He added more guns to the sides, more to the waist, and finally rigged the wiring himself, running through nights of sweat, smoke, and static. When his superiors told him it was impossible, he only smiled and said, "Then we will make impossible hurt." As the first tracers ripped through the sky, Dawson pushed the throttles forward. The modified B-25 screamed across the water. Behind him, other gunships followed, each one spitting fire from every angle. The air filled with thunder, the deep mechanical growl of machine guns shredding the dawn. Japanese gunners scrambled, their searchlights still chasing shadows, their guns firing too high, too late. In the next 60 seconds, history changed forever. The convoy that believed it was untouchable was about to learn what happens when one man refuses to follow the rules of war. The sea trembled beneath the roar of American engines, and above it all, Pappy Gunn's voice cut through the static one last time. "Light them up!" The moment Dawson pressed the trigger, the world erupted. Streams of fire burst from the nose of the B-25 like a living dragon. The guns roared in perfect rhythm, 8 heavy barrels vomiting lead straight into the side of the lead transport. The first shells tore through its bridge, slicing through metal and glass, sending men diving for cover. Smoke rose instantly, curling upward through the early dawn haze. The water turned white beneath the aircraft as bullets chewed through it, tracing deadly trails toward the next target. In the chaos, Dawson barely heard his own breathing. The plane rattled so violently he thought the wings might rip off, but the engines held, screaming in defiance of everything built to stop them. Behind him, Miller's voice cracked through the intercom. "They are burning, Captain. They are burning!" His words mixed with static, his excitement fighting against fear. Another burst of fire lit the horizon. The second B-25 swept low, unleashing a storm of rounds that ripped through the deck of a Japanese destroyer. Men scattered like sparks as the ship's anti-aircraft guns tried to find the invisible attackers cutting through fog and sea spray. The Japanese were trained for bombers that dropped payloads from 5,000 feet. They had never faced an American plane charging them head-on, point-blank, like a shark attacking a ship. Pappy Gunn's voice came through again, calm as ever. "Keep it tight, boys. Hit the lead ships. Break their spine." His tone carried no hesitation. To him, this was not madness. It was engineering. Every angle, every gun mount, every burst had been calculated in his mind months before this moment. He had seen too many young pilots die because their aircraft were built for another war, another enemy. Tonight, his invention was rewriting the rules. As Dawson banked hard left, his wingtip nearly kissed the surface of the sea. He could see the enemy convoy breaking formation. The once perfect line of gray hulls twisted into confusion, ships colliding, captains shouting orders lost in explosions. A destroyer turned its guns toward the sky, firing wildly, but the tracers missed by miles. The American formation moved too fast, too low, too precise. The gunfire from their modified bombers sounded like rolling thunder across the Bismarck Sea. In the radio silence that followed the first wave, Dawson exhaled, his hands trembling against the controls. The cockpit smelled of burnt gunpowder and oil. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Harris, turned to him, eyes wide behind his goggles. "We did it," he whispered. But Dawson shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Pappy did it." Far behind them, on the deck of his own plane, Pappy Gunn adjusted the throttle and scanned the chaos below. Every explosion reflected off the glass of his cockpit like a mirror of vengeance. He did not smile. He simply watched. To him, this was not glory, it was payback. The men lost in the Philippines, the airmen shot down without a chance to fight back, the helpless bombers that once carried too little firepower. This was their answer, written in fire across the Pacific sky. As dawn finally broke through the clouds, the horizon was a graveyard of burning steel. Smoke rose high into the golden morning, and the sea below boiled with oil and flame. Dawson's voice came through the intercom, soft but steady. "Convoy breaking apart, sir." "Mission successful," but Pappy's reply carried no celebration. "No," he said, "it is not success until they never sail again." He turned his bomber toward the next cluster of ships, engines howling, guns ready. The man who broke the rules of war was not done. He had just begun teaching the sky how to fight. March 4th, 1943, 6:01 a.m. The Bismarck Sea burned beneath a rising sun. Columns of smoke twisted upward, marking the graves of ships that had seemed unstoppable hours before. The air still trembled with the echo of gunfire, and the smell of salt and cordite filled every breath. Captain Frank Dawson's B-25 limped through the haze, bullet holes stitched across its fuselage. The engines coughed but refused to die. Through the shattered glass of the nose, he saw wreckage spread like an iron graveyard. But the job was not finished. Half the convoy still moved, engines roaring through oil-slicked waves. And Pappy Gunn was not the kind of man who left a battle half done. Inside his cockpit, Pappy adjusted the throttle and scanned the sea below. His eyes were calm, unreadable. The other pilots called him mad, but his madness had a method. Every attack was precise, every pass choreographed like a mechanic's dream brought to life. He studied how the ships turned, how their gunners panicked, how their formation fractured under pressure. He spoke quietly into the radio. "Second wave on me. We go again." No hesitation followed. The air crackled with affirmations. The young pilots had come to trust the man who once built airfields with his bare hands and welded guns in the middle of a thunderstorm. When Pappy said move, they moved. They knew he would never send them where he would not go himself. As the bombers dropped lower, the horizon flashed with new bursts of anti-aircraft fire. Shells exploded across the water, flinging white fountains into the air. Dawson flinched as a blast rocked his right wing. "We are hit," Harris shouted, gripping the controls. But Dawson steadied the plane, his voice calm. "Hold her steady. We are not done yet." The aircraft shook, but it held its line. The smell of burning fuel clawed through the cabin. Still, the guns stayed hot, barrels glowing red from the constant fire. Below them, the remaining Japanese destroyers weaved desperately, firing blind. But these bombers had become predators of the sea. They attacked in pairs, striking from angles no enemy expected. Each dive was measured, ruthless and exact. Pappy's modified B-25 came in last, its nose blazing like the mouth of a furnace. The rounds tore through a destroyer's bridge, shredding command posts and igniting ammunition below deck. A flash brighter than dawn lit the water as the ship's hull split open. Men dove into the sea, vanishing in waves of fire and smoke. In the radio silence that followed, Dawson heard only the drone of engines and the hiss of static. For a brief moment, the world felt weightless, like time itself had frozen above the wreckage. He looked out at the horizon, no longer lined with enemy ships but with drifting smoke and firelight reflecting off the waves. Then Pappy's voice broke through the quiet. "That is it, boys, pull out. We are done here." His tone was soft, almost tired. But beneath it was something deeper, a calm satisfaction that no metal could replace. As the bombers turned back toward the jungle airfields of New Guinea, the sunrise painted the sky gold and red. The Pacific was no longer the same. The Japanese Navy had learned that dawn what happens when ingenuity meets desperation. Dawson leaned back in his seat, eyes heavy, heart racing. "He did it," he whispered. "He changed the war." Back at base, when they landed hours later, mechanics and ground crew gathered in silence, staring at the bullet-riddled bombers that had defied death itself. Pappy climbed down from his plane, oil and smoke covering his hands. No speeches, no applause, just the faint smile of a man who had done what others said could not be done. He looked at the sky, nodded once, and said quietly, "Now let them rebuild their ships. We will be waiting." March 6, 1943. Port Moresby Airfield, New Guinea, 8:42 a.m. The jungle was heavy with the smell of fuel and rain. The B-25s that returned from the Bismarck Sea mission stood like wounded beasts along the muddy runway, their wings riddled with bullet holes, their engines still ticking from the heat. Mechanics swarmed around them, eyes wide with disbelief at what they had survived. No one spoke loudly. The silence carried a weight that words could not touch. The men who climbed out of those planes were not the same men who had taken off the night before. They had looked death in the eye and fired back with everything Pappy Gunn's madness could create. Inside a dim workshop built from salvaged metal and palm wood, Pappy stood over a dismantled engine block. His hands were black with oil, his shirt soaked through with sweat. Around him, a few young mechanics watched, silent, waiting for him to speak. Finally, without looking up, he said, "The enemy will adapt. So we will be faster." His voice was low, certain, almost surgical. He pointed at a chart pinned to the wall, drawings of gun mounts, wiring, armor plates, plans scribbled in grease pencil. "The next version will hit harder, climb faster, and take a beating twice as long. We are not building bombers anymore. We are building survival." Word of the victory had spread across the Pacific like wildfire. Commanders who once dismissed Gunn's experiments now wanted results. More planes, more firepower, more miracles. Photographs of burning Japanese ships reached headquarters before the pilots even slept. Yet, while officers debated strategy and reports, Pappy kept his focus on the hangar floor. He was not chasing medals or headlines. He was chasing perfection, the kind that could save lives. That night, Dawson sat outside his tent, cigarette trembling between his fingers. He watched the lights flicker inside Pappy's workshop. The man never stopped. Even after destroying half a convoy, even after turning the tide of a battle, He worked as if he had failed. Harris walked up behind him, silent for a moment, then said, "Do you think he ever rests?" Dawson shook his head. "Rest is for men who are done fighting. He is still fighting, just with tools instead of guns." In the days that followed, the base transformed into something no one recognized. Spare parts from wrecked planes became armor. Scrap metal turned into gun mounts. Ammunition belts were hand-fed through new chutes, designed with nothing but trial and error. Every sound in the night, hammer strikes, engine tests, the hum of generators, was part of Pappy's new war. He was turning the airfield into a factory of defiance, one that operated on sweat, caffeine, and raw belief. Sometimes, when the storms rolled in and lightning flashed over the jungle hills, men swore they could see him still working inside the hangar, sparks flying, his shadow moving against the walls like a ghost refusing to rest. He was not an officer now. He was an engineer of vengeance, building the next generation of machines that would fly low, hit fast, and never give the enemy time to breathe. By the time the rain stopped, the first of the new gunships rolled out of the hangar, the smell of fresh paint mixed with fuel as the engines came alive. They were heavier, louder, and deadlier. Pappy stood on the tarmac, eyes narrowed against the rising sun. Around him, young pilots gathered, waiting for orders. He simply said, "They will come again. And when they do, we will be ready." The engines roared. The airfield shook. The Pacific War was about to meet the next evolution of American ingenuity, built not by generals, but by a man who refused to lose. March 10, 1943, over the Huon Gulf, 6:23 a.m. The clouds hung low and bruised with rain, the horizon painted in streaks of gold and gray. Captain Frank Dawson sat in the cockpit of his newly modified B-25, the first of Pappy Gunn's next-generation gunships. The smell of oil, cordite, and sweat filled the cabin. Below them stretched a restless sea, scattered with whitecaps that looked like shattered glass. The radio crackled with the nervous chatter of young pilots, each trying to hide their fear beneath a layer of confidence. They had heard the stories of what happened at the Bismarck Sea, and now they were flying into their own chapter of it. Pappy's voice came through the headset, clear and calm. "Stay low, stay tight, and remember what these planes were built to do. You hit first, you hit hard, and you never let them breathe." His tone carried no emotion, no hesitation. To the men in the air, it was the voice of experience carved by loss and rebuilt with purpose. Every pilot in formation knew that when he spoke, they were hearing the same man who once hand-wired his own cockpit under enemy fire. The radar operator reported movement ahead. A supply convoy, smaller than the one destroyed days earlier, but still heavily armed. Dawson tightened his grip on the controls. He could feel the vibration through the seat, the rhythm of the engines pulsing like a living heartbeat. His co-pilot Harris scanned the horizon. "There they are," he whispered. Black dots against silver water lined in perfect formation. Dawson nodded once. "Then let's show them what happens when they meet Gunn's new design." As they descended, the gunships formed a wedge, their propellers slicing through mist and rain. The first burst of anti-aircraft fire rose from the convoy, tracing bright arcs through the sky. But this time, the planes were faster, heavier, and armed like nothing the Pacific had seen before. The modified gun mounts fired in synchronized fury, each round cutting through armor and deck plating with mechanical precision. The sound filled the sky like rolling thunder across a stormy plain. One Japanese destroyer fired a lucky shot, grazing the tail of Dawson's aircraft. The plane jolted, alarms blaring. Harris shouted, "Tail's hit! Stabilizer damaged." Dawson steadied his hand, sweat dripping into his eyes. "Hold her level. We are not breaking off." The bomber shuddered, but stayed on course. They came around again, guns blazing, raking the deck of a transport until its ammunition stores ignited. A brilliant flash lit the sky, followed by a shockwave that rocked every plane in formation. In the chaos, Gunn's voice broke through once more. "Stay together, boys. We are not fighting machines, we are fighting time." He knew the Japanese were adapting, building new defenses, recalibrating their gunners. Every second mattered. Every victory was borrowed from the next storm. As the last ship began to burn, Dawson pulled up, engines groaning in protest. The ocean below was a graveyard again, littered with twisted steel and drifting smoke. The B-25's wings glowed in the morning light, reflecting fire and rain all at once. The formation climbed higher, breaking through the last layer of cloud into a sky that felt impossibly wide. When silence finally returned, Harris looked over and said softly, "We are flying history." Dawson did not reply. He simply looked ahead, toward the fading horizon, and thought of the man on the ground who had made it all possible. Far behind them, in the humid silence of the New Guinea airfield, Pappy Gunn stood outside his hangar, listening to the faint thunder in the distance. He did not need to see the sky to know what that sound meant. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked toward the clouds, and whispered, "Good, they are learning." March 12, 1943, WWII Airfield, Papua New Guinea, 11:17 p.m. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the tin roofs and the muddy ground. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and burnt oil. Inside a dimly lit hangar, Pappy Gunn sat alone at a workbench scattered with broken instruments, shell casings, and a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. The battle reports lay open beside him, numbers, tonnage, losses, victories. On paper it was triumph, but to him every number carried a name. Every ship sunk meant another pilot who had gambled his life on his designs and made it back by inches. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted, but unwilling to stop. A young lieutenant stepped into the hangar, rain dripping from his helmet. "Sir, command wants your planes ready." March 15, 1943, over the Huon Peninsula, 4:38 p.m. The air was thick with heat and tension. Below the clouds, the jungle stretched endlessly, a sea of green hiding enemy bases, supply trails, and gun positions. Captain Frank Dawson's B-25 rumbled through the humid sky, part of a small strike group sent to cripple a Japanese supply route snaking along the coast. It was supposed to be a quick in-and-out mission, but nothing in this war ever went as planned. His crew sat silent, eyes fixed on the horizon, hands slick with sweat, despite the roar of the fans. Every man on board knew that somewhere below, hidden in the trees or waiting offshore, the enemy was already listening for them. Through the static, Pappy Gunn's voice came steady, commanding from miles behind the formation, "Keep altitude low. Do not give them time to react. Remember, surprise is worth more than armor." The words carried the weight of experience. No one argued. The men trusted him more than the manuals, more than the colonels who signed their orders. His methods had saved them before, and they believed they would again. As the coastline came into view, the first burst of anti-aircraft fire tore through the air. Black smoke blossomed near the lead bomber, rattling the formation. Dawson tightened his grip on the controls. "Hold formation," he ordered, his voice firm. The planes dove lower, skimming just above the treetops. Machine gun fire rose from hidden positions, tracer rounds streaking like fireflies in the fading light. The jungle exploded in flashes of orange as the bombers returned fire, their nose guns lighting up the valley below. The sound was deafening. Metal screamed, engines thundered, and the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and burning oil. Dawson's plane shook violently as rounds tore through the fuselage. Harris shouted over the intercom, "Left engine losing pressure." Dawson adjusted the throttle, his knuckles white. "Hold it together. We are almost on target." Through the smoke he could see the convoy of trucks crawling along a dirt road, headlights faint in the twilight. He lined up the approach, heart pounding. "Fire everything," he said. The B-25's guns opened up, unleashing a storm of lead that tore through the convoy. Trucks erupted into flames. Ammunition crates exploded, and the road vanished beneath waves of fire. The blast lit the clouds above, reflecting against the aluminum wings. Dawson pulled up sharply, the bomber groaning in protest. Behind him, one of the following planes was hit, trailing black smoke as it descended into the jungle. No parachutes appeared. The crew fell silent. Over the radio, Pappy's voice returned, steady, but with a weight Dawson had never heard before. Report status. Dawson swallowed hard. Target destroyed. One plane down. A long pause followed. Then Gunn replied quietly, "We will bring them home next time." When the bombers returned to base, the sunset bled across the mountains like fire. The airfield was quiet when they landed. No cheers, no celebration. Only the hum of engines cooling in the dusk. Pappy stood at the edge of the runway, watching the damaged planes roll in one by one. When Dawson climbed down, he met Pappy's eyes. No words were spoken, but both men understood the price of progress. That night, the hangar lights burned long past midnight. Pappy walked among the machines, touching each bullet hole, every dent, every scar. He knew what each mark meant, a moment where life and death had passed within inches. He picked up a wrench, set down his coffee, and began again. The war was far from over, and his plane still had work to do. March 22nd, 1943, Port Moresby Airfield. 2:11 a.m., the night was soaked in rain, the kind that turned dust into thick red mud and drowned every sound but the heartbeat of engines waiting to breathe again. Pappy Gunn stood alone under a flickering lamp, sleeves rolled up, cigarette trembling between oil-stained fingers. The hangar was a graveyard of half-alive bombers, torn wings, shattered glass, blackened metal. To most, they were junk. To Pappy, they were unfinished ideas. The storm outside thundered like distant artillery, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing faster than the propellers he tuned. Behind him, Sergeant Miller stepped in, holding a clipboard soaked through. "Sir, maintenance wants to know which plane gets priority for parts." Pappy did not look up. "All of them," he muttered. "But we are not fixing. We are changing," Miller frowned. "Changing, sir?" Pappy pointed toward the gutted B-25 in front of him. "That one there. She is not a bomber anymore. She is a hammer. And tomorrow, she is going to smash something that thinks it cannot be smashed." His voice carried no anger, only conviction. Outside, the wind howled. Mechanics worked by lantern light, their faces pale ghosts in the glow. Sparks danced as torches cut through steel. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and rain. Every rivet, every bolt was a gamble. The brass in headquarters had not approved these modifications. Some called them reckless, others illegal. But in the jungles of the Pacific, no one cared about paperwork. All that mattered was survival, and Pappy's planes were giving them a fighting chance. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the sky bruised with violet clouds. Pappy wiped his hands on a rag, staring at the beast he had built. The bomber's nose now bristled with 8 50 caliber machine guns, each perfectly aligned for maximum fire concentration. The side panels reinforced with salvaged armor from wrecked Japanese transports. In the back, ammunition belts hung like veins waiting for blood. Dawson walked up, still limping from the last mission. "Sir, the men are calling it the gunship." Pappy smiled faintly. "Let them. But remember, she bites back harder than she looks." The briefing room that morning was tense. Maps littered the table, circles drawn around enemy convoys hugging the coastline. Intelligence reports said a massive supply flotilla was moving toward Leh under heavy escort. Perfect target. The room filled with the scent of coffee and diesel. Pappy stood in front of the men, sleeves rolled up, voice low but clear. "We hit them at sunrise. Low, fast, straight through their teeth. Do not give them a chance to think. Do not break formation. The gunship will lead." When dawn broke, the sky was a pale gold ribbon over the sea. Engines roared to life, shaking the ground. Pappy climbed into the lead plane's cockpit beside Dawson. The crew exchanged quiet glances. No jokes this time, only the heavy silence that comes before something historic. As they taxied down the muddy strip, the wind carried the faint smell of salt from the ocean beyond. Pappy looked at the horizon. "They think bombers cannot fight," he said softly. "Let us show them what wrong looks like." The formation lifted into the air, engines echoing across the mountains. The Pacific shimmered below like molten glass. In that moment, every man aboard knew something had changed. They were not just pilots anymore. They were test pilots for survival, flying machines no manual had ever described. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the jungle. Somewhere beyond those clouds, an enemy convoy waited. And for the first time in this war, it was the Japanese who were about to be surprised. March 22nd, 1943, over the Huon Gulf, 6:03 a.m. The ocean below was calm, too calm, its surface glassy and indifferent to the machine slicing through the sky above it. Pappy Gunn's squadron flew in tight formation, their shadows racing over the waves like predators closing in on prey. Inside the lead B-25, Captain Dawson felt the steady vibration under his boots, a low growl that matched the rhythm of his pulse. The crew spoke little. There was no need. Every man knew the plan and every man knew the risk. Through the thin gray mist ahead, the Japanese convoy began to appear, tiny dots at first, then shapes, then full silhouettes of ships steaming in formation, guns already glinting in the newborn sunlight. They were headed for Leh, just as intelligence had said. The convoy stretched for miles, escorted by destroyers whose decks bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Dawson stared through his sight line. "There they are," he whispered. In the co-pilot seat, Pappy's eyes narrowed. "Do not wait for orders. Hit them before they can breathe." The radio came alive with static and heavy breathing. "All flights, arm your guns," Pappy said. "We are going in low. The first run will be for shock." The words fell like an electric charge through every cockpit. The bombers descended, cutting altitude until the waves whipped their bellies with salt spray. The sea turned from calm blue to chaos, wind and water fighting as propellers clawed the air. Then the first tracer rounds flashed from the Japanese destroyers, red streaks ripping through the mist. Dawson gripped the yoke, forcing his bomber lower. "Steady," he said. "We go now." The gunship roared ahead, its nose erupting in fire. Dozens of .50 caliber rounds shredded through the deck of a Japanese transport, tearing through guns, lifeboats, and rails. The ship's crew scattered in panic. The air was filled with the deafening roar of engines and the constant hammering of machine guns. One after another, the American planes tore through the formation, their low passes leaving trails of smoke and destruction in their wake. The Japanese gunners fired back, but their shells went high. The Americans were too low, too fast, their flight path unpredictable. Pappy's modifications had turned the B-25 from a medium bomber into a flying fortress of short-range death. Where once a single pass might have dropped bombs and fled, now each run unleashed a torrent of gunfire that stayed on target until there was nothing left standing. The ocean itself seemed to burn, waves glowing orange under the reflection of exploding ships. Inside the cockpit, Pappy's hands never stopped moving, adjusting throttle, correcting angle, shouting coordinates into the intercom. Dawson's face was streaked with sweat, his throat raw from shouting over the noise. In the rear, Miller fired through the side window, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "They are breaking, sir." "The convoy is breaking." Pappy's reply came calm and sharp. "Then chase them. Do not let them breathe." The formation wheeled around for another pass. The gunfire from the Japanese ships grew erratic. Their formation was collapsing. Dawson's bomber screamed past a destroyer's bow so close he could see the faces of sailors ducking behind gun shields. Another wave of tracers ripped through the air, grazing the tail but missing the engines. Behind him, the rest of the gunships followed, their coordinated fire tearing through the convoy like a storm of steel. In less than 7 minutes, 2 transports were burning, one destroyer listing hard to port, and the sea littered with debris. The pilots could hardly believe it. These modified bombers had done what no torpedo squadron had managed in months. They had broken the unbreakable. Over the intercom, Dawson exhaled slowly. "They are done," he said, but Pappy's eyes stayed fixed on the smoke below. "No," he murmured. "Not yet. We will finish the lesson." March 22, 1943. Bismarck Sea, 6:41 a.m. The horizon was on fire. Smoke rose in twisting black columns that stretched toward the sun, each one marking where a ship had fallen. The sea that once carried thousands of Japanese soldiers now churned with oil and wreckage. The roar of engines still filled the air, but it was no longer the roar of battle. It was the sound of dominance. Pappy Gunn squadron circled low over the chaos, their planes scarred, their gun barrels glowing from the heat. No one spoke. The sky was theirs, and the silence that followed was heavier than any victory song. Captain Dawson's gloved hand trembled on the throttle. He could still feel the recoil of the guns vibrating in his bones. His oxygen mask hung loose around his neck as he scanned the horizon for survivors. The convoy that had set out with confidence hours earlier was gone, its ships cracked open, its decks torn apart. The Japanese destroyers that had once guarded their transports now lay tilted in the water, smoke pouring from shattered funnels. "My God," whispered Sergeant Miller from the rear turret. "We actually did it." Dawson did not answer. He looked at the sky ahead, still half expecting enemy fighters. None came. Pappy leaned forward in his seat, his eyes locked on the fading smoke trails below. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. "Stay sharp," he said into the radio. "We hit them hard, but war never ends clean." His voice carried the weight of experience. Every man listening knew what he meant. They had won this morning, but in the Pacific, victory was temporary, and peace was always out of reach. The planes regrouped over open water. The damage reports came in, bullet holes through wings, cracked windshields, engines running hot. But not a single aircraft was lost, not one. The impossible had been done. The same bombers that High Command once called obsolete had just annihilated a heavily armed convoy through sheer audacity and engineering genius. Pappy looked out through the cockpit glass at the other B-25s flying beside him. Each one bore the scars of battle, streaks of black soot and bullet dents across their fuselages. To him, they were perfect. Hours later, as the formation landed back at Port Moresby, ground crews ran to meet them. The first men out of the planes were met with stunned silence. No one believed what they were seeing. "They came back," one mechanic whispered. "All of them." Pappy climbed down from the cockpit last, his uniform soaked in sweat, his face streaked with soot. Reporters would later call him a maverick, a rule breaker, a renegade genius. But that morning he was just a man who refused to lose. In the debriefing tent, Dawson sat across from him, still pale, still shaking. "Sir," he said quietly, "if you had not done this, we would not have made it back." Pappy looked up from his notes, his voice steady but distant. "If I had not done this," he said, "no one would have." News of the mission spread fast across the Pacific. Commanders who once dismissed Gunn's ideas now demanded his designs. Within weeks, factories back in the States began producing new B-25 gunships modeled after his field modifications. They called them the B-25G and H models, official, legal, and powerful. But those who had flown with Pappy knew the truth. The real weapon had never been the guns or the armor. It had been the spirit of one man who refused to follow the rules of losing. That night, long after the base had gone quiet, Pappy sat alone near the runway, watching the lights of the incoming planes blink against the dark. The jungle beyond the airfield was alive with distant thunder. He drew a slow breath, his hands still stained with oil and gunpowder. Tomorrow the war would demand more. It always did. But tonight, for the first time, he allowed himself a moment of silence, a moment to remember what defiance could do when guided by purpose. The Pacific slept uneasy that night, and somewhere across the sea, Japan's admirals rewrote their strategies in disbelief. The age of the bomber had changed forever, and the man who made it happen did not wait for permission.